In the dust-worn frontier of 1852, where superstition rode as heavily as six-shooters, one tale still chills the bones of every settlement that dares whisper it. They say a woman once accused of witchcraft escaped the Noose, vanishing into the barren wilds while her accusers celebrated her death. Years later, she returned, alive, unbroken, and carrying a silence sharper than any blade. Within a single month of her reappearance, every man and woman who had spoken against her was found lifeless, their bodies scattered across the prairie towns that had once mocked her name. Some called it vengeance, others a curse. And though history buried her under faded ink and yellowed paper, the echoes of her survival and the trail of death that followed remind us of one truth. In the West, justice was not always written in law, but in shadows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1852, and the town of Ashwood Creek had already begun to forget its darkest hour. Nestled in a stretch of dry land where prairie grass bowed low against the constant push of the wind, Ashwood was the kind of settlement that clung to life with grit and prayer. The people worked the earth, raised cattle, tended to their small church, and believed fiercely in the justice of their own hands. They had little in the way of law, no judge in permanent residence, no marshal that stayed longer than a season, but they had each other, and their fear. It was fear, after all, that had carried them through that notorious trial almost a decade earlier, when whispers of sorcery and unnatural deeds filled the saloon, the general store, and the pews of their clapboard church. Back then, fear was a currency more valuable than silver. A single accusation could brand a woman as an enemy of God, a threat to the land itself. And among the accused was one name that had since been buried in silence: Orlith Denevar. She was not born in Ashwood Creek. Folks said she arrived one spring, her boots caked with dust from distant roads, carrying little more than a satchel of herbs and a gaze that never bent beneath the weight of judgment. Some called her healer. Others whispered witch. Her remedies worked in ways that unsettled the town's men, who trusted whiskey more than poultices, prayer more than tinctures. And when sickness spread through the livestock, when infants failed to survive the fever, it was easier to point at her than at the cruel hand of fate. The trial that followed was swift, rough, and without mercy. Orlith was dragged to the wooden platform at the edge of town, a noose dangling above her head. The preacher read his verses, the townsfolk jeered, and men who had once sought her help stood among her accusers, eyes cold, lips spitting venom. When the trapdoor fell, dust rose like smoke into the air. They swore she had been left lifeless, her body hanging under the unforgiving sun. By dusk, they claimed, her soul was condemned. By morning, her name was erased. But the earth of Ashwood Creek does not keep secrets kindly. 9 years later, under the red haze of an autumn dusk, Orlith Denevar returned. It was James Smith, the stable hand, who first saw her silhouette on the horizon. He swore later that the sky bent in strange colors behind her, as if the sun itself dimmed in deference. Her hair, streaked with silver that had not been there before, fell in wild strands over her shoulders. She carried nothing but a lantern that did not flicker, though the wind was merciless that evening. She walked into Ashwood without hurry, her boots striking the packed earth with a rhythm like a drumbeat. Some men spat on the ground, whispering she was a ghost. Others ran indoors, slamming shutters, calling for their wives and daughters. The preacher's bell rang out, clanging against the dusk as if the iron itself trembled. But Orlith did not falter. She stepped into the center of town, eyes sharp, mouth set in silence. No accusation left her lips, no plea, no curse. She only looked. And it was enough. Within days, the first body was found. William Brown, one of the loudest voices at her trial, collapsed outside the saloon, his face twisted in terror, though no mark marred his skin. A week later, Alexander Davis, the preacher's aide, was discovered in the church, stiff and lifeless, the Bible still in his hands. Then Michael Miller, who had tied the knot of the noose himself, was found near his barn, staring blankly at the rafters as though seeing her shadow even in death. By the time the month had closed, every man and woman who had testified against her, every finger that had pointed, every tongue that had spit venom, lay dead. no wounds, no sickness, no reason the town doctor could explain. The people whispered of curses. They whispered of justice, and some whispered that perhaps she had never been hanged at all, that she had tricked them, cheated death, and carried vengeance across the years like a secret flame. But what unsettled them most was this: Orlith Danavar never denied the accusations, nor did she claim them. She lived on the edge of Ashwood, a cabin built from rough timbers and the bones of silence, her lantern always burning in the window. Those who dared pass at night swore they heard a whisper carried on the wind, a voice soft as grass brushing against boots. "I remember you." The prairie wind carried her legend far, but here, in Ashwood Creek, the tale is not told as history, it is told as a warning. For in a land where justice came by rope and fire, Orlith Danavar showed that survival was its own kind of vengeance. And those who raised their voices against her learned the lesson too late. But the question that lingers, and perhaps will always linger, is this: was it truly her hand that claimed them? Or did fear itself rot their souls, each heart succumbing to the very terror it once cast upon her? Tell me, if you lived in Ashwood Creek in 1852, if you saw her walk back into town with that silent gaze and that lantern burning steady against the wind, would you have faced her, or would you have hidden behind your shuttered door? To understand why Orlith Danavar's return struck the town of Ashwood Creek with such terror, you must first know how the people had cast her out. In those days, the West was not only wild in its dust and danger, it was wild in its faith, in its suspicion, and in its judgment. A settlement like Ashwood did not survive on lawmen and courts. It survived on rumor, on the sway of the preacher's voice, and on the iron weight of community fear. Orlith arrived in Ashwood Creek in the spring of 1843. The trails were rough then, wagon ruts cutting deep into the prairie earth, the roads pocked with mud after a season of rain. She came alone, a figure wrapped in a dark cloak, with sharp eyes that measured every detail of the town as though she had seen it before in a dream. She rented a corner of a cabin from the widow Abigail Moore, who needed coin to feed herself and her 2 daughters. Orlith carried no family name that the town recognized, but she carried knowledge, the kind that unsettled neighbors. She knew the use of roots and the power of herbs, and in a place where medicine came in bottles of whiskey and prayers from the pulpit, her craft was both salvation and suspicion. When fever spread through Ashwood Creek the following summer, it was Orlith who mixed teas of willow bark and sage. She boiled cloths soaked in mint and lavender to ease the burning foreheads of the sick. More than a dozen people survived because of her. And yet, when those same people recovered, they gave their thanks not to her but to God, claiming prayer had lifted the illness. Orlith never argued. She only watched. But for every life spared, there was one lost, and those losses became the seeds of her downfall. It began with Martha Brown, a woman who miscarried in the late autumn of 1844. Her grief was raw, her cries echoing through the wooden walls of Ashwood's chapel. She claimed she had sought Orlith's remedies, that strange teas and bitter powders had cursed her womb instead of healing it. The preacher, a stern man named Reverend Caleb Wright, took her sorrow as proof. In his sermons he began to speak of unnatural women, of those who walked with knowledge not given by God. He spoke of serpents that whispered secrets into the ears of Eve, of temptresses who led men astray. His words, heavy with fire, kindled suspicion like dry straw catching flame. By winter the stories spread. Michael Miller, the blacksmith, swore he had seen Orlith speaking to herself in the woods. Alexander Davis, the preacher's aide, claimed her herbs gave off smoke that carried whispers into the air. William Brown, Martha's husband, said he had found one of Orlith's charms buried near his barn, a twist of bone and string that looked like a spell. None could prove these claims, but proof was never needed in Ashwood Creek. Fear was enough. It was David Anderson who struck the match that lit the fire. Anderson was a cattle rancher, proud of his herd and his land. When disease swept through his cattle in the spring of 1845, he blamed Orlith. He said she had cursed his animals after he refused to pay her for a remedy. The preacher's sermons gave him fuel, the whispers of the town gave him courage, and soon the town square was alive with calls for justice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ashwood Creek had no proper court, but it had its own form of trial. On a gray morning in April, Orlith was dragged from Abigail Moore's cabin, her wrists bound in rough rope, her satchel of herbs thrown to the dirt. They gathered in the square, men with guns on their belts, women clutching children close, eyes wide with both fear and hunger for spectacle. The Reverend stood on the makeshift platform beside Orlith, his Bible in hand, his voice carrying above the restless crowd. He spoke of purity, of cleansing the land of darkness. He read from Exodus, from Deuteronomy, from passages that spoke of witches not being allowed to live. And then he called the names of her accusers. Martha Brown spoke first, her face pale, her voice trembling with grief and rage. She swore Orlith had poisoned her with bitter herbs, that her womb had withered under Orlith's care. William Brown, his jaw tight, claimed he had seen Orlith's shadow moving when her body had not. Michael Miller testified that her herbs filled his forge with foul air, driving the fire to spark unnaturally. Alexander Davis said her presence chilled the church itself, that candles flickered when she entered. David Anderson shouted that she had cursed his herd, bringing rot to their lungs and weakness to their bones. One by one they stood, voices raised not with evidence, but with anger. The crowd shifted with every word, fear wrapping tighter around their hearts. And Orlith? She said nothing. Her silence was her weapon. Though few understood it, she did not beg, did not argue, did not offer the knowledge of her craft as defense. She looked upon each accuser with steady eyes, her lips closed, her hands bound but unshaken. Some said her silence was admission, others whispered it was defiance, but no one forgot the weight of her gaze, as if her memory etched their faces into her mind for eternity. When the rope was placed around her neck, the sky above Ashwood darkened with clouds that rolled in sudden and swift. The wind rose, whipping dust through the square. The Reverend read his verses, but his words were carried away by the gale. Still, the townsfolk did not falter. The trap door fell, and the crowd gasped as the rope snapped taut. Yet when dusk fell and the square emptied, when the townsfolk returned to their homes, no one kept watch over the body. No one checked to see if breath still lingered in her chest, or if fate had loosened the knot that sought to end her. By morning, the platform was empty. They told themselves the body had been buried in secret. They told themselves the preacher had carried her away. They told themselves many things, anything but the truth that might have unsettled them more than any curse. From that day, her name was never spoken aloud again. Ashwood Creek moved on, burying its fear under routine, under cattle drives and church bells, under the dust of everyday life. But deep down, in the marrow of the town, her memory lived on. And when she returned nearly a decade later, the silence she carried was heavier than any words she could have spoken. What would you have done, standing in that square in 1845, watching a woman accused by neighbors, condemned by fear, silenced by a rope? Would you have joined the chorus, calling for her end, or would you have stood in the silence with her, knowing that in Ashwood Creek, a single voice of dissent could make you the next accused? The night Orlith Danavar returned to Ashwood Creek was one the townsfolk would recount in hushed voices for years, though each telling grew more distorted, more drenched in the speaker's own fear. What never changed in any version was this: her lantern burned steady, untouched by wind, and her silence weighed heavier than any curse. James Smith, the stable hand, was still young enough to be dismissed as fanciful. He had seen her first, standing just beyond the prairie grasses as the sun bled into the horizon. He swore her outline shimmered, as if heat rose from her very skin, though the air that night had cooled sharp enough to bite. He told anyone who would listen that he heard her boots long before he saw her shape, each step hitting the dirt in rhythm, steady, inevitable, like a drum summoning its army. By the time she entered the town proper, the word had spread from the stables to the saloon, from the saloon to the church, from the church to every cabin where shutters trembled against the prairie wind. Windows cracked open, eyes peered out, and whispers surged like wildfire. She's come back. It's her ghost. No ghost carries a lantern. Then she's something worse. Children pressed their faces against window glass, only to be yanked back by pale mothers. Men who had once spoken boldly in the square now shrank into shadows, their hands hovering near their pistols but never daring to draw. Orlith walked through Ashwood's heart as though the years between had not passed. She did not glance at the saloon, where William Brown used to sit and jeer at her silence. She did not look toward the blacksmith's forge, where Michael Miller once spat on her remedies. She did not bow her head at the church, where Reverend Wright had condemned her with verses as chains. Her gaze moved slow, steady, cutting across every shuttered window, every cracked open door. The town froze under that gaze, as though every face she saw was being marked, written onto some invisible ledger. When she reached the square, the very place where rope had once dug into her skin, she stopped. The crowd that had begun to gather did not move closer. Lantern light swayed on the porches, illuminating faces twisted in fear. No one spoke. No one dared. Then she turned without a word and walked toward the edge of town, her lantern bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp. She left behind silence thick enough to choke, the kind of silence that burrows under the skin and festers. That night, no one slept. Men gathered at the saloon, voices low, mugs untouched. Reverend Wright prayed until his throat went hoarse, sweat dripping down his brow despite the chill. Martha Brown locked her door and clutched her Bible, her knuckles white, her whispers frantic. Michael Miller oiled his pistol again and again, though his hand shook each time he tried to load it. Each one of them, every soul who had stood against her at the trial, felt the weight of her eyes. The next morning, the town stirred restless and hollow-eyed. They told themselves it had been a trick of the dusk, that perhaps it was not her but some drifter carrying resemblance, yet no one dared ride out to confirm it. The prairie seemed wider, emptier than before, and the woods near the creek carried a hush that made even hunters keep away. Then came the first death. It was William Brown. He was found outside the saloon, face down in the dust, his hands clawed at the earth, as though trying to pull himself into the ground. His mouth hung open, lips cracked, but no scream had escaped. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the sky, pupils blown wide with terror. The town doctor, an old man named Samuel Green, pressed his ear to William's chest, searched his skin for wounds, for fever, for some mark that could explain it. But he found nothing. The man had simply ceased, his body whole but his soul torn away. News spread with the sunrise. Men and women gathered in clusters outside their cabins, their voices hushed but urgent. Some swore they had seen her lantern near the saloon just hours before William fell. Others claimed they had heard footsteps circling their homes through the night, though no prints marked the dirt come morning. Reverend Wright called for calm, standing tall in front of his church, his voice quaking only slightly as he declared the Lord was their shield. But even he avoided the square that day, his sermons cut short, his eyes darting toward the tree line where shadows lingered too long. By the week's end, fear had twisted into frenzy. Every creak of a floorboard, every whistle of wind through the prairie grass became proof of her presence. Mothers refused to let their daughters fetch water from the creek alone. Men walked in pairs to the stables, their hands never far from their rifles. And still, no one dared confront her cabin, though smoke rose steady from its chimney at dusk, and her lantern burned through the night like a single, unblinking eye. Then came the second death. Alexander Davis, the preacher's aide, was found slumped against the altar inside the church. He had been alive the night before, seen praying with Reverend Wright. By morning, his body was cold, his fingers curled around his Bible so tightly that they had to be pried open. His eyes mirrored William's, wide, terrified, as though frozen on something no one else could see. The doctor again found no cause, no illness, no wound, only fear. Now the town no longer whispered, they shouted. The saloon filled with angry voices, demanding action. Some called for torches, others for prayer, others for running her out once more. But beneath the bravado was trembling, and every man knew what none dared say aloud. They had killed her once, or thought they had, and it had only brought her back. What could another rope do? What could bullets do against someone who carried the weight of the grave in her silence? And so the question twisted in every throat. Was Orlith Danavar killing them, one by one, or were their own sins finally claiming them? The prairie winds did not answer. They only carried her lantern light, faint but steady, from the edge of the woods into the heart of Ashwood's nightmares. Ashwood Creek was never a large town, but it had always been a proud one. A cluster of cabins and storefronts straddling the hard-packed trail, it stood as proof that men and women could carve life out of the wild prairie if they only believed hard enough. They had endured droughts, stampedes, sickness, and even the occasional outlaw raid. Yet nothing had ever broken them like this. Not the land, not the storms, not hunger. It was fear. Fear of a woman they thought buried long ago that tore them from within. After William Brown and Alexander Davis fell, a shadow lay over every street. The saloon, once alive with laughter, turned into a hushed den where men sat with full mugs that never touched their lips. The church, once brimming with hymns, became a place of trembling, where prayers cracked under the weight of dread. Even the stables were quiet, horses shifting nervously as though they too felt the unseen eyes on the town. It was the third death that cracked the illusion that Ashwood Creek could survive this storm. Michael Miller, the blacksmith, was found in his barn one morning, slumped against the anvil that had been his life's work. His hammer lay beside him, his calloused hands stiff in death. His eyes mirrored the others, wide, terrified, as though his final moments had been a gaze into something unspeakable. The sheriffless town could offer no answer. The doctor's words grew thinner each time, until finally he confessed in a whisper that he could no longer explain what he saw. Word traveled fast across the plains. Neighboring settlements caught wind of Ashwood's curse, and travelers began avoiding its trail. Merchants turned their wagons elsewhere, fearful that even stepping foot on its soil would bind them to its fate. Ashwood was not only haunted, it was abandoned by the world around it. The townsfolk turned inward, and in doing so, they began to devour themselves. Martha Brown, already hollowed by grief, shrieked in the streets that Orlith was coming for her next. She begged her neighbors to take her in, to keep her safe, but doors shut in her face. She had once been the loudest in condemning Orlith, and now her voice cracked with desperation. Some whispered that she brought this curse upon them, that her accusation had been the spark that doomed them all. Her husband lay in the ground, her womb empty, and her heart sick with terror. Reverend Wright tried to hold the town together with his sermons, but each Sunday fewer came. He thundered from the pulpit, calling Orlith a servant of darkness, insisting that faith alone would shield them. Yet his voice betrayed him, each verse trembling as though even Scripture could no longer bear his conviction. At night, he was seen pacing outside the church, lantern swaying in his hand, muttering prayers that cracked like glass. The widow Abigail Moore, who had once given Orlith shelter, became a figure of suspicion. Though she had never accused Orlith, never spoken against her, the townsfolk now eyed her cabin as if it were a nest of vipers. Some claimed she still spoke to Orlith, that her silence was proof of secret allegiance. She denied nothing, offered no defense, which only sharpened their suspicions. It was in this mire of fear that another death came, and with it, the unraveling of the town's fragile bonds. David Anderson, the rancher who had blamed Orlith for his diseased herd, was found dead in his field. His cattle circled nervously, stamping at the dirt near his body. His face was frozen in the same look of terror as the others, his hat lying a few feet away, brim torn as though he had clawed at it in panic. By now, no one asked the doctor for answers. They already knew what would be found. Nothing. Nothing but fear carved into flesh and bone. And so the cycle repeated. Each death tightened the grip of dread, and each day the town sank deeper into suspicion and despair. By the second week of her return, Ashwood Creek was unrecognizable. Families huddled in their cabins with shutters barred. The saloon closed its doors, the piano silent, its keys gathering dust. The church bell tolled not for sermons but for burials, its mournful clang ringing through the air like a curse of its own. Children no longer played in the dirt roads. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by whispers and sobs. The town's council, what little of it remained, gathered in secret one night at the back of the general store. Reverend Wright sat stiffly, his Bible resting on the table, hands trembling as he clutched it. Michael Green, the doctor, sat pale and gaunt, his eyes ringed with sleepless nights. A handful of men joined them, none of whom had accused Orlith, but who feared their own lives were now forfeit. "She means to kill us all," one man whispered, his voice barely louder than the creak of the lantern above, "one by one until there's nothing left." "It's not her," the doctor muttered, though his voice betrayed no conviction. "It can't be her. I've seen bodies wasted by fever, by cholera, by thirst. This is something else. They're being consumed by fear itself." Reverend Wright slammed his hand against the table, the sound cracking like gunfire. "Do not speak weakness. Do not speak blasphemy. This is her work, and we will cast it back into hell where it belongs." But no one moved to join him in that conviction. The men exchanged hollow glances, their courage crumbling like old wood. For they knew the truth, none dared say. The rope had not stopped her once, and fire or bullets would not stop her now. Outside, the prairie wind howled against the walls, carrying with it a faint light in the distance. Some swore it was her lantern, glowing steady through the night. The next death struck Martha Brown. She had locked herself in her cabin for days, refusing food, muttering prayers until her voice cracked. Neighbors said they heard her crying through the night, then laughing, then screaming. When silence finally fell, it was not relief but dread that took hold. They found her body curled on the floor beside her Bible, her eyes fixed wide in terror. The deaths no longer shocked the town, they numbed it. The living carried on with hollow faces, each glance over the shoulder heavy with dread. Some began to leave Ashwood Creek altogether, wagons creaking down the trail with little more than a bedroll and a hope to outrun what lingered here. But most stayed, bound by fear as much as by the land itself. For where could they go? The prairie was wide, but whispers of Orlith's return had already spread. To leave Ashwood was to risk carrying her memory with them, and memory was as much a curse as her lantern's light. It was around this time that the whispers began. Not the whispers of men and women afraid, but whispers that seemed to rise from the prairie itself. Children claimed to hear voices when the wind blew across the grass. Hunters said the woods near Orlith's cabin carried murmurs like distant conversations, though no one was there. The brave, or the foolish, swore that if you walked close enough to her cabin at night, the whispers formed words. Words like, "I remember," and "I see you." The town began to rot from the inside. Trust, once the only glue that held Ashwood Creek together, crumbled. Neighbors eyed each other as potential traitors, convinced someone among them had struck a bargain with her. Rumors swelled that Abigail Moore met Orlith in the woods under the cover of night, that Reverend Wright's prayers were ignored because his hands were stained with guilt, that the doctor had stopped seeking cause because he already knew it. It no longer mattered whether Orlith truly killed them. The people of Ashwood Creek were killing themselves with fear. And yet Orlith never entered town again. She remained on the outskirts, her lantern burning steady, her silence louder than any curse. The deaths continued until nearly every accuser had fallen. Their graves lined the edge of the churchyard, a grim row of headstones that grew longer with each passing week. The preacher's sermons rang over them, but even his voice cracked, his fire dwindling into ash. By the end of that month, Ashwood Creek was a shell of itself. Those who survived moved like ghosts, speaking little, sleeping less. And always, the lantern burned at the edge of the woods. Ashwood Creek had always been a town of voices. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter spilling from the saloon, the hymns rising from the church, even the lowing of cattle in the distance. Together, they wove the sound of life on the frontier. But after Orlith Danavar returned, the voices dwindled, one by one, leaving behind silence that pressed against every cabin wall. By the 5th week, silence was the town's truest sound. Only a handful of her accusers remained, and with each sunrise they awoke with the knowledge that night might be their last. The graves in the churchyard grew like a spreading stain, each stone a reminder of what awaited. The people who had once demanded Orlith's execution now looked upon one another with suspicion, wondering who among them would be next. Reverend Caleb Wright refused to surrender to despair. At least that was the image he presented to his dwindling congregation. Each Sunday he stood in the pulpit, Bible clutched in one trembling hand, voice rising with fire that cracked like dry timber. He called Orlith a demon, a temptress, a plague sent to test their faith. He thundered that the Lord alone could deliver them, that every death was a trial of belief. But his flock had thinned to a handful of gaunt faces, their eyes empty, their hymns whispered rather than sung. The Reverend stepped forward, his voice rising above the wind. "Oiletenivar!" he shouted, his tone trembling but loud. "By the power of the Lord, we cast you out! Show yourself and face his judgment!" The cabin remained silent. Only the lantern glowed, its light unwavering. The group shifted, fear spreading like wildfire through their ranks. Some muttered prayers, others clutched their lanterns tighter. Abigail Moore stepped forward, her voice sharp. "She owes us no words. We gave her none when we condemned her." The Reverend's face twisted with fury. "Do not defend her. She is the serpent among us." He moved toward the cabin, his boots crunching against the dirt. The others hesitated, their breath caught, their eyes wide. The closer he drew, the louder the wind seemed to howl, carrying with it whispers that grew clearer, sharper. "I remember you." The Reverend froze, his body rigid, his eyes darting wildly. He spun toward the others, his face pale as bone. "Did you hear it?" he gasped. They had. Every one of them had heard it. A voice soft as the wind, yet sharp as a blade, carried through the clearing. "I remember you." The lantern flared, its glow brightening, casting shadows across the trees that seemed to writhe and twist. The group cried out, some dropping their lanterns, others stumbling back. The Reverend clutched his Bible, shouting verses that cracked against the night. Then the door of the cabin creaked open. A figure stepped into the doorway, cloaked in shadow, her hair wild, her eyes glinting with light that was not fire. Orlith Danavar stood before them, silent, still, her lantern's glow casting her in hues of gold and black. She did not speak. She did not move. She only looked at them, one by one, her gaze steady, unblinking, carving their names into eternity. The Reverend dropped to his knees, his Bible falling to the dirt. His voice broke as he begged, pleaded, wept. The others scattered, fleeing into the trees, their screams swallowed by the night. Abigail Moore remained, standing tall, her face set, her eyes meeting Orlith's without flinching. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lantern's glow dimmed. The cabin door closed. The clearing fell silent. By morning, Reverend Wright was found dead outside the church, his body sprawled in the dirt, his eyes wide with terror. The Bible lay beside him, its pages torn as though clawed by his own desperate hands. The others who had fled the woods returned pale, shaken, muttering of whispers that had followed them, of shadows that would not let them go. The last of Orlith's accusers had met his end. Ashwood Creek was broken. Ashwood Creek had once dreamed of being more than just another dot on the frontier map. Travelers spoke of its fertile fields, of its timber, of its position along the trail. Merchants imagined it might grow into a city someday, a place with railroads and stone streets. But after Orlith Danavar's return, Ashwood Creek stopped being a place people came to. It became a place they fled. The accusers were gone, every last one, their graves lining the churchyard like broken teeth. Reverend Wright lay among them, his final sermon preached not from the pulpit but from the terror etched into his dead face. The few who had stayed behind after his death felt the weight of silence pressing on them. Without the Reverend, there was no voice to anchor their fear, no authority to tell them how to fight it. What lingered in the streets was not guidance, but whispers, brittle and directionless. The first to leave were the merchants. They packed their wagons with goods, loaded their families, and vanished eastward. Soon after, the blacksmith boarded up his forge, the echo of his hammer fading into memory. The saloon closed its doors, its windows dark, the piano inside covered in dust. One by one, shutters clapped shut, doors were nailed, chimneys went cold. The town hollowed out, its skeleton left behind in the form of creaking signs and empty barns. By mid-autumn, less than a dozen families remained. Most stayed not out of courage, but out of poverty or stubbornness. They had nowhere else to go, and abandoning Ashwood Creek meant abandoning the only roots they had ever sunk into the earth. But life in the town had changed. Lanterns no longer burned freely at night. Those who remained covered their windows with cloth, locking doors and barring shutters before dusk. Fires burned low, not to keep out the cold but to keep shadows from dancing on the walls. Children were warned not to wander, though few had the desire. The laughter of youth had vanished, replaced by hushed voices and the crackle of wood in stoves. Those who dared to speak of Orlith Danavar did so only in whispers, their words bending under fear. Some called her a curse, others a spirit, others still a revenant, who had slipped the noose and traded flesh for something eternal. What united them all was the belief that she still watched, her lantern glowing somewhere in the woods beyond the edge of town. And sometimes, they said, the lantern came closer. Reports began to spread of a light moving among the trees at night, swaying with a rhythm too steady to be a trick of the wind. Hunters swore they had seen it near the river, glowing faintly across the water. A farmer's wife claimed she had glimpsed it outside her window just before dawn, hovering at the edge of her field. When she opened the door, it was gone, but the soil where it had glowed was blackened, as though scorched by unseen fire. The sheriff of a neighboring town rode in one morning, drawn by stories that carried faster than wagons. He found Ashwood Creek nearly deserted, its main street empty, its saloon abandoned, its churchyard crowded with too many graves for a town so small. He asked questions, but the townsfolk answered little. Those who spoke told him only that Orlith Danavar had returned, and that every accuser was dead. The sheriff laughed at first, dismissing it as frontier superstition. But when he pressed harder, when he demanded to know who was responsible for the bodies in the ground, the survivors grew pale and silent. They would not say her name again. By sundown, the sheriff was gone. He never returned. And so the town was left to itself, its silence deepening, its isolation complete. Those who stayed began to cling to rituals of survival. Some carved symbols into their doors, crude charms meant to ward off evil. Others left offerings at the edge of the woods, bowls of milk, bread, sometimes even trinkets of silver or gold, placed with trembling hands as though bargaining with something that could not be bought. The church, once the heart of the town, was abandoned. Its doors hung open, its pews empty, its altar covered in dust. No one dared enter after Reverend Wright's death. Instead, gatherings were held in homes, where neighbors whispered prayers not found in Scripture, prayers half invented and half remembered, words that blurred the line between faith and superstition. They lit candles and set them in windows, not to guide the living but to keep out the dead. But no matter what they did, the lantern light remained. It became part of the town's rhythm, as inevitable as sunrise and sunset. People began to mark nights not by the phases of the moon, but by whether or not the lantern appeared. Some said it was drawn to fear, that the more they whispered of it, the brighter it glowed. Others believed it was not Orlith herself, but the souls of those who had wronged her, bound to her lantern like moths to a flame, wandering the woods forever. Whichever was true, Ashwood Creek was no longer a town of the living. It was a town of waiting, of endurance, of people who measured their days by how long they could survive under the weight of her silence. And yet, stories of Orlith spread. Travelers carried them eastward, weaving them into campfire tales. Cowboys whispered of her on cattle drives, claiming to have seen her lantern on distant ridges. Settlers on the plains swore that when they spoke her name aloud, coyotes fell silent, and the wind stilled. Her legend grew beyond Ashwood Creek. By the second winter after her return, Ashwood Creek was nearly gone. Only 3 families remained, stubborn or too poor to flee. Their cabins huddled close together, lanterns flickering weakly against the prairie night. The rest of the town stood as a shell, buildings rotting, signs swinging loose, windows shattered by storms. Snow drifted through broken roofs, covering floors where once children had played. The last blacksmith's forge stood cold, its tools rusting. The saloon's bar sagged under the weight of dust. The churchyard, swollen with graves, stood as the town's only monument. And still the lantern burned. It was not seen every night, but it was seen often enough that no one doubted its presence. Sometimes faint, sometimes bright, it lingered at the edge of vision, always beyond reach. The survivors stopped trying to explain it. They no longer asked if Orlith was alive, or if she was something else entirely. They only accepted that she remained, as inevitable as death itself. The town was hers now, whether she walked its streets or not. Ashwood Creek had become a hollow place, a warning carved into the prairie. Travelers who passed through told of its silence, its boarded windows, its graves that outnumbered its living. Some said they had seen a woman standing in the churchyard, lantern in hand, her face hidden by shadow. Others claimed they had heard her voice on the wind, whispering names not their own. And always, the story ended the same way. 2 weeks later, the lantern appeared again, this time at the Quell's cabin. Nadira Quell woke to find its glow spilling beneath her door. She clutched her children to her, whispering prayers, waiting for the door to burst open. It never did. By dawn, the glow was gone, but a faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, though no fire had touched their home. The survivors took these sightings as omens. They whispered that Orlith was not finished, that even after the last accuser's death her vengeance lingered, demanding more. Some claimed the town itself was guilty, that all who remained bore the stain of silence, the sin of watching her die and doing nothing. And so they waited, hollowed by dread. Outside, the land did not care. The prairie winds howled, snow buried the ruins, wolves howled in the distance. To the earth, Ashwood Creek was just another settlement failing under the weight of time. But to those who remained, it was a prison of memory. Every building reminded them of laughter lost, of voices silenced, of graves too numerous to count. By spring, only the Johnsons remained. The Quells had vanished without a word. Their cabin stood empty, their hearth cold, their possessions left behind as though they had risen in the night and walked into the woods. Some said they fled east, too afraid to stay another season. Others whispered they had not fled at all, that Orlith's lantern had guided them into the dark, never to return. The Johnsons tried to hold on, but the weight of isolation broke them. Their fields refused to grow, their animals sickened. Their children no longer laughed or played, only stared with hollow eyes. Emily's husband took to sitting outside with a rifle across his knees, waiting for a shadow that never came. But the lantern did. One night it appeared in the middle of the town's main street, glowing steady as though daring him to fire. He raised the rifle, his hands shaking, his breath ragged. He fired once, twice, 3 times. Each shot cracked through the night, echoing against the ruins. The lantern did not flicker. By morning, his body was found sprawled in the snow, the rifle at his side. His chest bore no wound, but his eyes were wide, his face twisted in terror. Emily buried him alone, her hands raw from the frozen earth. She wept until her voice broke, then fell silent like the rest of the town. For months she lived with her children in the cabin, waiting, watching, dreading. They survived on what little food remained, scavenging from abandoned homes. Sometimes she thought she saw the lantern in the churchyard, other times in the window of the saloon. Once, she swore it followed her reflection in the water of her basin. Her children stopped speaking altogether. By the end of that year, Ashwood Creek was empty. Travelers who passed through found cabins abandoned, fires cold, graves untended. The Johnsons were gone, the Quells gone, every last family gone. But at night, from the trail, they swore they could see a lantern glowing among the ruins, swaying gently, steady as ever. And so Ashwood Creek passed into legend. It was no longer a town, no longer a place where men built lives and families. It was a ghost on the prairie, a hollow name whispered by wagon drivers, a shadow cast across the frontier. To some it was a cautionary tale of fear and superstition. To others it was proof that justice, once denied, could never truly be buried. But to those who believed, to those who listened for whispers in the wind, Ashwood Creek was not gone at all. Because Orlith Danavar's lantern still burned. And it always would. By the time 1856 dawned, Ashwood Creek no longer existed in any meaningful way. The cabin sagged under storms. The saloon's piano keys were warped and broken. The church's steeple leaned like a drunk too long in the sun. Snow, wind, and rain erased the prints of human hands, leaving only ruins for the prairie to reclaim. But while the town died, the story did not. The tale of Orlith Danavar and her lantern spread faster than wagons on the trail. Cowboys whispered it on long cattle drives, their voices low as the fire crackled. Prospectors in the mountains told it between swigs of whiskey, glancing over their shoulders at every gust of wind. Families crossing the frontier repeated it to their children, half to scare them into obedience, half because the story felt too real to ignore. The details shifted, as all legends do. In some tellings, Orlith had never been hanged at all. She had been burned or drowned or buried alive. In others, she had risen not a week later but the very next night, her body glowing with fire that no rope could kill. Some swore her lantern burned with the souls of her accusers trapped inside, their faces visible in the flame. Others said she wandered with no face of her own, only shadow beneath a hood, her lantern the only sign she existed at all. But the core of the story remained the same. Every accuser had died, the town had withered, and Orlith Donovar's lantern still burned, a light that no darkness could consume. The snows of 1854 fell early and thick, blanketing Ashwood Creek in silence deeper than any grave. By then, the town was barely a town at all. Only 3 families remained, clustered near the southern edge, where cabins stood within sight of one another, as if huddling together could fend off the weight of emptiness. The rest of Ashwood Creek was dead. The saloon sagged under drifts of snow, its doors broken from years of storms. The blacksmith's forge was little more than a shell, tools rusting beneath the open sky. The church stood tallest but hollow, its steeple cracked, its bells silent, its windows rattling in the prairie winds. The graveyard behind it sprawled, markers jutting from the earth like bones, so many that snow could not hide them all. The silence was suffocating. Those who remained lived as shadows of themselves. They woke each morning not with plans for growth or harvest, but with the weary hope of surviving another day. Their fields lay mostly barren, their animals few. What little trade remained came from travelers who dared pass through. Hunters, wanderers, the occasional wagon train. But even those were rare. Most avoided Ashwood Creek, guided by whispers of curses and shadows, by tales of the lantern that never died. The survivors did not call her name anymore. They spoke of her only as her or the lantern. To name her was to invite her. To remember her was to tempt her. And yet, despite their silence, she lingered. Some nights the lantern burned at the edge of the woods, faint but steady. Other nights it glowed nearer, among the ruins of the town itself. Once, a man swore he saw it flicker inside the church, shining through the broken windows as if the building had come alive again. Another time, a woman claimed to see it hovering by her well, its glow reflected in the water before vanishing with the dawn. Each sighting hollowed them further. Fear was not a sudden terror anymore. It was a constant weight, a dull ache in their bones, a sickness of the spirit. They moved slowly, spoke rarely, lived quietly, as though noise itself might draw her nearer. And yet, beyond Ashwood Creek, her legend grew. Travelers carried the story from campfire to campfire, embellishing details until truth and myth blurred. Some claimed she walked with the lantern in hand, her eyes glowing like embers, her voice soft as the wind. Others swore she had no face at all, only shadow beneath her hood. A few even told of bargains, of men who ventured into the woods with offerings of silver and returned with wealth, their pockets full, but their eyes empty. Every tale ended the same way. Ashwood Creek was cursed, its people broken, its witch unburied. For the survivors, these stories were salt in a wound. They lived with her shadow every day, but outsiders turned their torment into entertainment. Hunters asked to be shown the lantern, as if it were a carnival trick. Cowboys dared one another to sleep a night in the ruins of the saloon. A group of young men from the east even carved their names into the church doors, laughing as they left. None of them stayed long, and none returned. The survivors watched them go with silent eyes, never warning, never speaking. What good were warnings when no one listened? Winter pressed harder, food ran low. One family fled, their wagon creaking eastward in the snow. That left only 2. The Johnsons and the Quells. They had once been neighbors, sharing tools and meals, raising barns together. Now they barely spoke, fear gnawing at what had once been kinship. Each family huddled in its own cabin, watching smoke rise from the other's chimney, measuring life not by seasons, but by survival. It was during this winter that the lantern came closer than ever. The first to see it was Emily Johnson. She had been tending her fire late one night, the rest of her family asleep, when she glanced toward the window. There it was, glowing just beyond the glass, no more than 10 feet away. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen. The lantern did not move. It hung there, steady, its light reflecting in her wide eyes. She could not bring herself to scream, could not wake her husband or children. She only stared, her hands clutching the chair so tightly her knuckles went white. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. In the morning, Emily swore she found blackened footprints in the snow outside, leading from the trees to her window. But when she showed them to her husband, the prints vanished before his eyes, melting away as though they had never been there at all. After that night, the Johnsons barely slept. Ashwood Creek accused her, Ashwood Creek killed her, Ashwood Creek paid the price, and her lantern still burned. Travelers who passed through the ruins claimed to see it, glowing in the windows of empty cabins or drifting through the graveyard. Some said it appeared as a faint flicker, easily dismissed as a trick of the eyes. Others swore it was bright enough to guide them like a beacon, though none dared follow. A few unlucky souls tried. They walked toward the glow, their boots crunching in the abandoned streets, their breath quick in the cold night air. None returned. It was not only the common folk who listened. Chroniclers and newspapermen caught wind of the tale, hungry for stories that would sell in crowded eastern cities. They wrote articles filled with lurid detail, describing Ashwood Creek as a cursed settlement, abandoned by God, and haunted by its own sins. Illustrators sketched crude drawings of a woman in tattered skirts holding a lantern, her eyes glowing, her accusers cowering before her. The more the story spread, the less it belonged to truth. But at its heart, something real lingered, something no one could deny. Too many had seen the lantern. Too many had walked the streets of Ashwood Creek and felt the silence press against their bones. One such chronicler was Elias Turner, a writer who drifted through frontier towns in search of tales to sell. He arrived in Ashwood Creek in the spring of 1857, his notebook tucked into his coat, his spectacles fogging in the cold dawn air. He found the town exactly as the stories described, abandoned, hollow, its windows dark, its graveyard swollen. Elias was not a superstitious man. He believed in ink and paper, in stories told for coin. Ghosts, witches, curses, those were tools of drama, nothing more. He walked the streets of Ashwood Creek with calm steps, jotting notes, describing the rot of buildings, the tilt of the steeple, the silence that hung like smoke. It was only when he stood in the graveyard that doubt began to creep in. The graves stretched farther than he had expected, each marked with names he had seen in second-hand journals: Brown, Davis, Miller, Anderson, Thompson. He wrote them down, tracing their patterns, noting how many had died in the same year. He began to write a sentence about fever or plague, but the words caught in his throat. Because there, among the graves, he saw it. A lantern. It glowed faintly, hanging in the air near the church doors. Elias blinked, rubbed his eyes, told himself it was a trick of light. But when he looked again, it was still there, swaying gently as though held by an unseen hand. His breath quickened, his pen slipped from his fingers. He took one step forward, then another. His boots crunched on the gravel. The lantern did not move. It waited. Elias told himself this was the moment. This was the story that would make his name. He reached out, his hand trembling, his mind spinning with words he would write: proof, truth, legend captured. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the lantern vanished. Only darkness remained. Elias staggered back, his heart hammering, his breath sharp in the cold air. He searched the graveyard, the church, the empty street, but the lantern was gone. He fled Ashwood Creek before dawn, his notebook half filled with scribbles, his hands shaking. In the weeks that followed, he wrote his article. He described the graves, the ruins, the silence. But he never wrote of the lantern. That detail he kept to himself, locked away in memory, burning in his mind like a flame that would not die. Others were not so cautious. A group of cowhands passing through dared one another to sleep in the saloon. They drank, laughed, sang songs off-key. At midnight, they claimed they saw a glow in the upstairs window. One went to investigate. The others never saw him again. By morning, his bedroll was empty, his boots left at the top of the stairs. A traveling preacher declared Ashwood Creek a place of sin, a warning to all who doubted God. He stood in the main street, shouting sermons to the empty air, condemning Orlith as a devil. That night, the lantern glowed in the church steeple. By morning, the preacher was gone. His Bible lay open in the dirt, its pages damp with dew. With each story, the legend grew. Some claimed Orlith was not bound to Ashwood Creek at all, that her lantern wandered the plains, appearing on lonely trails and guiding travelers to their doom. Others said she had become a patron saint of the wronged, that women whispered her name in secret prayers, begging for justice where none could be found. Her story shifted to fit the needs of those who told it. To some, she was a monster. To others, a martyr. To many, she was proof that the frontier was not only wild but haunted, that its soil held not just bones but curses. By the end of the decade, Ashwood Creek had vanished from maps. Travelers avoided it. Guides steered wagons around its ruins. But the story could not be erased. It had taken root, not just in the West, but in every place where whispers traveled. Orlith Danavar was no longer only a woman. She was a legend, a shadow, a flame that burned in the dark, refusing to die. And wherever her story was told, men lowered their voices, glanced over their shoulders, and wondered if the lantern was closer than they thought. By the time the iron rails began carving across the West, the tale of Orlith Danavar had long outgrown the ruined timbers of Ashwood Creek. Her name no longer belonged to a single town or to a list of rotting graves. It had spread like prairie fire, unstoppable, untamed, whispered by tongues that had never even walked the dust of Wyoming. Her lantern was no longer bound to a place. It was bound to fear. Cowboys swore it had appeared along the cattle trails at night, bobbing in the distance like the light of a campfire. Some followed, thinking they had found shelter, only to vanish without a trace. Prospectors digging for gold in Colorado told of a pale glow that flickered at the mouth of abandoned mines, daring them to enter. Railroad workers laying track through the endless plains swore they saw the lantern hovering along the rails, keeping pace with the locomotive, until it disappeared into the night. No two stories agreed on the details. To some, the lantern glowed gold, steady and warm, like the promise of safety. To others, it flickered blue, cold and cruel, a flame that cut through fog like a blade. Some claimed they could see Orlith's figure behind it, shrouded in rags, her face hidden, her silence louder than thunder. Others swore the lantern floated alone, no hand to hold it, no shadow to follow it. But always the ending was the same. Those who mocked the light were lost. A rancher near Kansas named Silas Braden laughed when his hands spoke of the lantern. He called it nonsense, superstition for drunkards and fools. One night he boasted he would ride straight toward it if he ever saw it, rope it like a stray calf, and bring it home to prove them all wrong. 2 weeks later, his horse returned to the ranch, saddle torn, reins dragging. Silas was never seen again. In Nevada, a group of miners dared one another to follow the glow into the hills. They carried whiskey and pistols, their voices loud with false courage. The next morning, only one returned, staggering, his hair white, though he was barely 30. He never spoke again, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Preachers used the story as sermon fuel. Some declared Orlith a demon, her lantern the flame of hell, a lure to drag sinners into darkness. Others painted her as a sign of divine justice, a spirit who punished cruelty when earthly courts failed. Women whispered her name with quiet reverence, invoking her as a protector against men who abused their power. In the hush of boarding houses and laundries, they spoke of her as one who had endured, one who had not bowed, one who had turned her suffering into retribution. And so her story divided the West. For every soul who trembled at the thought of her, another felt a strange kinship, as though Orlith Danavar were more than a ghost. She was a mirror, reflecting the truth that the frontier was cruel, and survival sometimes demanded silence, sometimes demanded fire. By the 1870s, her story had reached the ears of scholars. Not men of the frontier, hardened by trail dust, but men of libraries and parlors, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that fogged when they grew excited. They wrote letters to one another, trading scraps of information about Ashwood Creek, about vanished travelers, about the pattern of deaths that always followed sightings of the lantern. One such man was Dr. Elias Granger, a historian from St. Louis who became consumed by the tale. He had collected dozens of accounts, From cowboys and miners, from widows who swore the lantern had passed their window, from drifters who carried scars that burned whenever they spoke her name. To Granger, Orlith was not myth. She was proof. Proof that the past could linger. Proof that injustice could leave marks that even time could not erase. His obsession drove him west. In 1874, he set out with nothing but a wagon, a notebook, and a determination to see the lantern with his own eyes. He traveled from one ghost town to the next, following whispers, tracing half-forgotten trails. In Dodge City, he spoke with a saloon girl who swore she had seen the lantern drifting across the plains, always keeping its distance. In Cheyenne, he found an old trapper who carried a scar across his chest, claiming he had reached for the light and felt it sear him like iron. Granger wrote everything down. He began to map the sightings, charting them across the West. The pattern disturbed him. The lantern was not random. It moved. From Kansas to Colorado, from Wyoming to Nevada, the sightings followed a slow, deliberate path, as though Orlith was not bound to one graveyard or one town, but was walking, step by step, across the land itself. When he arrived at the ruins of Ashwood Creek, the heart of the story, he found little more than rot and silence. The cabins were long collapsed, the church a skeleton of beams, the graveyard swallowed by weeds. Yet when the sun set and the prairie fell into shadow, he swore he saw a glow flickering in the distance. It came closer. Granger stood frozen, his notebook clutched in his hand. The lantern swayed as it approached, its light steady, golden, almost inviting. He thought he saw the shape of a woman behind it, her outline blurred by darkness. He whispered her name, his voice shaking, Orlith Danavar. The lantern stopped. For a moment the world was silent. Even the wind stilled, the grass unmoving. Granger raised his hand, reaching, not with mockery, but with reverence. The lantern's glow flickered, then vanished. When dawn came, Granger's wagon was found on the outskirts of Ashwood Creek. His notebook lay inside, filled with his neat script, ending with a half-finished sentence. She is not bound to death. She is... Granger was gone. His disappearance only deepened the legend. His notes were published posthumously, passed from scholar to scholar, from preacher to preacher, from outlaw to outlaw. Some called them proof of her existence. Others said they were merely the ravings of a man who let fear consume him. But the pattern he had mapped remained undeniable. The lantern was moving. From that point forward, sightings of Orlith Danavar grew more frequent. She was no longer confined to Ashwood Creek, but wandered the west freely, appearing wherever injustice lingered, wherever whispers of cruelty rose. A rancher who beat his wife swore the lantern burned outside his window, and days later he was found dead in the fields. A judge notorious for corrupt rulings was seen trembling in his chambers, muttering about a glow he could not escape. Weeks later he vanished on the road between towns, his carriage discovered empty. To some, this was proof that Orlith's lantern had become more than vengeance for her own suffering. It had become a force that punished cruelty wherever it took root. A justice untamed by law, a flame that burned in the silence where courts failed. By the 1880s, Orlith Danavar was no longer just a name. She was an emblem, a myth stitched into the fabric of the frontier. Her story was told in ballads sung around campfires, in dime novels sold at train stations, in whispers carried by women who prayed not for salvation, but for justice in shadows. And still, the lantern burned. Men claimed it followed the railroads, keeping pace with the engines that carried progress westward. Women swore it appeared in their dreams, guiding them through fields of darkness. Outlaws feared it, whispering that it hunted those who spilled innocent blood. What began as the curse of one town had become the curse of the land itself. And though decades had passed since Ashwood Creek's last breath, no one who spoke of Orlith Danavar doubted that somewhere, out in the endless dark, her lantern still moved. By the closing years of the 19th century, the frontier was changing. Railroads split the prairies, towns rose from dust with brick and glass instead of timber, and the wild edges of America were tamed mile by mile. But even as the land shifted under the weight of progress, some things refused to be erased. One of those was the legend of Orlith Danavar. Her story no longer belonged only to Ashwood Creek. That town was long gone, its wood rotted, its name erased from maps, its graves swallowed by grass. Yet every cattle trail, every mining camp, every campfire along the open road carried her name like a curse and a prayer. The lantern was still seen. Not often, not predictably, but often enough that whispers could not be dismissed. A group of cowboys trailing herds north claimed to see it dancing in the night, far out on the plain. At first, they thought it was a campfire, then a wagon light. But as it drew closer, they realized no one held it, no one walked with it. The flame hovered on its own, steady as the stars. 2 men swore it called to them. They followed. They never returned. Their horses came back riderless, their saddles torn by something none could name. In Kansas, a preacher recited her tale in a fiery sermon, condemning her as an unholy spirit, the product of a godless age. That night, the townsfolk said they saw a glow moving through the streets. The preacher's house was found empty by morning. His Bible sat open on the table, its last line underlined, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. But Orlith Danavar was not only a warning to men who defied her. To many, she had become something else, an icon of survival, a figure of strange reverence. Women whispered her name, as if it carried protection. They told their daughters that Orlith's flame was not wicked, but just, that it lingered to remind the world that injustice would not go unanswered. In saloons and boarding houses, her story took on new shapes. Ballads were sung of the woman with the lantern, her voice lost but her vengeance eternal. Dime novels painted her as a ghostly wanderer, cloaked in shadows, punishing cruel sheriffs and lawless men. She became as much a part of frontier myth as Billy the Kid or Jesse James, a figure who blurred the line between history and legend. But beneath the songs and stories, the lantern remained real. Travelers along lonely roads swore it followed them, weaving between the hills, its glow reflecting in their wagon wheels. Some said it guided them safely to towns when they were lost. Others said it led them deeper into wilderness, never to be seen again. Prospectors claimed it glowed at the mouths of mines, warning them away. A few ignored the warning. None lived to tell what lay within. One account, written in 1889 by a schoolteacher traveling west with her family, described the lantern in chilling detail. She wrote of waking at night to see a golden glow moving outside her wagon. At first, she thought it was another traveler. But when she stepped closer, she saw nothing holding it. Just flame, swaying, steady, alive. She whispered a prayer. The lantern flickered, then vanished. Her journal ended with these words. It felt as if it listened. It felt as if it chose. The notion that the lantern chose its victims unsettled even the boldest men. No one could predict when or where it would appear. It seemed tied not to land, not to graves, but to deeds. Cruelty, injustice, betrayal. These were the trails it followed. Wherever wrongs were done, whispers spread that Orlith's flame would come to balance them. Some lawmen dismissed the tale as superstition. Others did not. A marshal in New Mexico, known for brutal methods, scoffed at the story until he began to see a glow outside his jailhouse. For nights it lingered, unblinking. Then one evening he vanished from his own cell, though the door remained locked. His keys lay on the floor beside his gun belt. By the end of the century, Orlith Danavar had become more than a ghost story. She was an embodiment of the West itself, untamed, unforgiving, carrying a justice not bound by laws or courts. She was remembered in whispers, in fireside tales, in the silence of men who had seen her flame and lived to speak of it. And as the century closed, as the frontier shrank under the march of railroads and telegraph wires, her story endured. Some said she had grown restless, that with the wilderness vanishing, her lantern would fade. But sightings continued. In 1892, a railroad conductor swore he saw the glow pacing alongside his train, keeping speed for miles before vanishing into the hills. In 1895, a widow in Colorado claimed the lantern burned outside her window the night her abusive landlord was found dead in his barn. In 1899, a group of boys exploring an abandoned homestead stumbled upon a lantern burning bright in the parlor. They fled in terror, but when townsfolk investigated, the house was empty, no lantern to be found. The century turned, and Orlith's flame did not dim. What began in Ashwood Creek as a tragedy had become something greater, an eternal warning, a reminder carved into the bones of the land. The lantern was not only vengeance for one woman's suffering, but a symbol that the past could not be buried. that injustice left scars too deep for time to heal. Orlith Danavar's name faded from official histories, written off as superstition, erased from ledgers and sermons. But among the people her story lived on. Mothers hushed their children with it. Men told it in saloons with lowered voices. Wanderers prayed to it when lost on the trail. And always, somewhere out in the dark, a glow lingered, sometimes gold, sometimes blue, sometimes steady, sometimes flickering. The West changed. Towns rose, trains roared, telegraphs sang, but the lantern never vanished. Those who saw it swore it was more than fire, it was memory, it was justice. It was the flame that refused to die. And even now, when the wind sweeps across abandoned ghost towns, carrying the smell of dust and the echoes of voices long gone, some say you can still see it, burning against the horizon, waiting, watching, reminding all who dare to listen that the past is never truly buried, and that some flames will outlast the dark. Orlith Danavar was gone, but her lantern burned still. By the turn of the century, Ashwood Creek was nothing more than a memory whispered on the wind. Its name never returned to maps, its graves never restored, its cabins left to the prairie's hunger. Yet the story of Orlith Danavar remained, carried forward not by books or ledgers but by voices. Everywhere the West expanded, the lantern followed. Wanderers swore it appeared along rail lines, keeping pace with the future as iron engines roared into the horizon. Prospectors told of it burning in abandoned shafts, a warning that no vein of gold was worth ignoring the past. Families settling on new frontiers whispered that a woman's shadow sometimes passed across their fields, her lantern glowing just beyond reach, as though marking the land before they claimed it. And still, no one could explain it. Some scholars insisted it was only story, folklore born of guilt and fear. They said the lantern was a trick of the mind, a way for settlers to make sense of the harshness of frontier life. Others clung to their belief that Orlith's spirit lingered, that she was a flame carried not only by the wind, but by justice itself. But whether myth or truth, the lantern endured. Even now, on nights when the prairie is silent and the horizon blurs into shadow, travelers whisper of a faint glow hovering in the distance. They tell of a light that moves when no hand carries it, that sways against winds that should have blown it out, that lingers too long to be dismissed as chance. Some turn away, refusing to look. Others watch, drawn closer, knowing the risks, feeling the weight of centuries in that single flicker. And every so often, someone vanishes, their names fade, their graves unmarked, their stories swallowed. But the lantern burns brighter for it, its glow never diminished, never defeated. Ashwood Creek may be gone. Its buildings have rotted, its graves sunken, its people long forgotten. But Orlith Danavar remains, her silence etched into the land, her flame a testament that injustice cannot be erased. So if you ever find yourself on the edge of an abandoned town, if the night is still and the air feels heavy, look to the horizon. If you see a lantern swaying in the dark, steady and golden, do not follow, do not call her name. Because the past does not forget. And Orlith Danavar's lantern still waits. Ashwood Creek was dust. Its cabins had collapsed, its fences consumed by grass, its wells filled with mud and silence. By 1900, there was not a single marker left to prove a town had ever stood there. Even the graveyard was gone, its markers toppled, the names erased by storms and time. Yet people still spoke the name Orlith Danavar. It was never spoken loudly, always in whispers. By then she was no longer a woman in their stories. She was a force, a shadow that walked where the law had failed, where cruelty went unpunished. The lantern was her face, her hand, her voice. Some said it was fire stolen from the gallows. Others said it burned with the breath she never had a chance to draw. No one could agree on what it meant, but everyone knew it was real. The new century tried to bury her. Progress rolled across the plains with steel and smoke, drowning superstition in telegraph wires and city lights. But the lantern could not be buried. Stories came from the edges. Railroad conductors swore they saw the light pacing their engines in the emptiest stretches of prairie, vanishing when they slowed. Women in small towns whispered that it burned outside their windows after nights of violence in the streets, and that men who struck their wives or daughters would be found dead before dawn. Prospectors who returned empty-handed from the mountains swore the lantern glowed at the mouths of abandoned shafts, warning them to leave. Each story carried the same weight. The lantern did not wander without reason, it chose. Scholars debated in parlors far from the West, publishing articles in journals, reducing the lantern to folklore, the witch to a figment of memory. They argued she was only a metaphor, a tale built to explain tragedy, a way to give shape to the violence of frontier life. They called her a myth, a ghost, a story for dime novels and pulp sheets. But the frontier knew better. Men who had lived hard lives on the open range, men who had seen storms and graves and the cruelty of their own hands, did not speak her name lightly. They knew what they had seen. They knew who she was. In 1902, a widowed homesteader named Ruth Collins wrote in her journal about the lantern. She described a night of fear, when a land baron rode to her door demanding she surrender her claim. She had no one to protect her, no law to call upon. That night, as she lay awake with her children, she saw a golden glow outside her cabin. It drifted along the fence line, swaying as though it measured the ground. By morning, the land baron was found dead near the creek, his face twisted in fear, his horse gone. Ruth never forgot the sight of that light. In her final entry before her death, she wrote, "She came for me. She saved me." The lantern had become more than vengeance. It was protection. But protection came with a cost. For every story of the lantern saving the wronged, there was another of men who disappeared after mocking it, of wanderers who followed its glow into the wilderness and never returned. It had no mercy for fools. It had no patience for doubt. To see it was to be tested, and not all survived the test. As decades passed, Orleth Danavar became a figure caught between fear and reverence. To some, she was a demon, cursed to wander the plains until the end of time. To others, she was a saint, proof that the dead could rise to balance the scales of justice. Most did not dare decide. They only whispered, and they only warned. If you see the lantern, turn away. Ghost towns dotted the West by then, abandoned settlements left behind, as railroads shifted trade and fortunes failed. Travelers claimed the lantern moved among these ruins, drifting through broken windows, lighting streets that had been silent for decades. A group of boys in Arizona swore they saw it in an old saloon, hovering above the piano. When they ran, one turned back. He was never seen again. The lantern had no boundaries. It belonged to silence, to ruin, to wrongs that refused to stay buried. And so the story lived on. Ballads were written, sung in saloons and campfires, songs about a woman wronged and a flame that walked. Dime novels painted her as a ghostly outlaw, wandering the West to punish the wicked. Preachers used her name as a warning, some calling her Hell's Flame, others a sign of divine reckoning. Her story bent with the teller, but it never broke. Because at its core, there was a truth too heavy to deny. Ashwood Creek killed her. Ashwood Creek fell. Every accuser died. And the lantern burned on. By 1910, few living had ever known Ashwood Creek, but everyone knew the story. Ranch hands in Texas whispered of a glow moving along the horizon. Women in Colorado told their daughters never to chase lights in the dark. In Montana, a sheriff admitted to his deputy that he had once seen a lantern swaying in an abandoned barn. He never spoke of it again, but his hands trembled when storms rattled the windows. The lantern had become the West's inheritance, a story older than railroads, older than barbed wire, older than law. And it endured because it spoke to something deeper than fear. It was not just a ghost story, it was a reminder that injustice leaves echoes, that silence does not mean surrender, that a flame lit by cruelty can burn long after the gallows rot. The epilogue of Orleth Danavar was not an ending, it was a beginning. Because every year someone else swore they had seen it. A drifter on a back road, a woman standing at her cabin door, a man walking alone after dark. They all told the same story, a glow in the night, steady and patient, watching. And whether they lived to tell it or vanished into silence, the lantern burned on. It still burns. And if one day, on a road far from town, you see a flame swaying in the dark, steady as a heartbeat, do not follow, do not speak her name. Do not believe you are stronger than the stories. Because the past remembers. And Orleth Danavar's lantern still waits. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.